The governor's daughter asked what my name was in front of a room full of officials. This was November 1858, Richmond, Virginia. A formal ceremony in the governor's residence. Chandeliers washoven, 28 years old, enslaved. Standing against the wall holding a silver tray, she looked past everyone positioned to be seen by her, looked directly at me, and asked, "What is your name?" I answered, "Joseph, miss." That answer cost me 7 years. I was reassigned to the stables the next day, kept away from the main house, removed from any position where I might be visible during formal events. The story spread through the household, became a cautionary tale told to new servants. The governor's daughter once asked a servant his name, created a scandal. The servant disappeared, but I did not disappear. I was there the whole time, working in the stables, listening to my own erasure. After the war, one testified to a union commission, told them what that moment revealed, how much work the system required to maintain the fiction that we were invisible, that we had no names. One question, one answer, 7 years of consequences. The question is not why she asked. Curiosity is human. The question is, why did a system that claimed we were naturally inferior have to work so hard to prevent anyone from learning our names? I entered the hall carrying messages on an evening in November 1858. The chandeliers were already lit, casting yellow light across marble floors and gilded mirrors. I had been trained to walk without sound in public rooms, to move like air through spaces where important people gathered. This was the governor's residence in Richmond, Virginia. I had worked there for 3 years as a house servant, assigned to carry correspondence and maintain the function of formal events. My role was to be present but invisible, useful but unremarkable. I kept to the wall as I entered, eyes forward, holding the silver tray with letters addressed to various officials. The gathering was settling into position for the evening ceremony, some kind of recognition, event for civic leaders and their families. Officials arranged themselves by rank and distance from the main dais. I had learned where not to stand through careful observation and occasional correction. The system of placement was rigid and unspoken. Governors and judges near the center, lesser officials radiating outward, servants against the walls or in alcoves. I stopped where protocol placed me against the east wall near the doorway to the service corridor, holding my tray at chest height, eyes lowered but aware of the room's movements. The doors at the far end opened wider. More guests entered. The crowd shifted to accommodate them. The governor's daughter entered then, and attention followed her like a wave. She was 18, dressed in pale blue silk, moving with the careful grace of someone raised to be watched. I had seen her many times in 3 years, but always from this same distance, always as part of the invisible backdrop of her life. I had been reminded more than once that eyes decided worth in these spaces, that looking too directly at white women, particularly high-status white women, could be interpreted as insolence or desire or threat. So I lowered my gaze further to avoid any possibility of notice. But the room's silence tightened in a way that made me glance up briefly. She was looking past the room's careful arrangements, looking past the officials and guests who had positioned themselves to be seen by her. She was looking at me. Moments when invisibility failed were dangerous. I had learned this in previous placements, when the system's careful separation broke down. When a servant was suddenly visible as a person rather than a function, consequences followed. I stilled my hands and my breath, held my posture exactly, gave no reason for the attention to continue. But her attention held. Her eyes remained fixed on my position against the wall. A pause broke the flow of ceremony. The room noticed her noticing. Heads turned slightly to see what had captured her focus. I had been warned by older servants never to answer freely when addressed by white people in public spaces, that the truth was often less valuable than the expected response, that honesty could be weaponized against you in ways silence could not. I prepared to step back into the service corridor, if dismissed, or to offer some neutral response, if questioned. She spoke. Her voice was clear and carried across the sudden quiet. "What is your name?" The question was simple and direct. but it landed in the room like something forbidden. Governors' daughters did not ask servants their names in front of assembled officials and guests. The system depended on maintaining distance and anonymity. I weighed silence against consequence in the space of a heartbeat. Silence might be seen as defiance. Speech might be seen as presumption. Both carried risk. The room waited. Eyes turned toward me instead of toward the dais where the ceremony was supposed to begin. I had learned to choose words carefully in my 28 years, to offer truth in the smallest possible form, to answer what was asked without revealing anything that could be used against me. "Joseph, Miss," I said. My voice was quiet, but clear enough to reach her. The answer landed and did not disappear. It existed now, in the space between us, witnessed by a room full of people who were not supposed to witness such an exchange. This was the first time my speech had changed the attention of a room. I held my posture, unmoving, keeping my eyes lowered again. The ceremony could not resume unchanged. The natural flow had been broken by her question and my answer. Protocol demanded that servants remain nameless and interchangeable. She had violated that protocol, and I had been forced to respond. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Not loud, but present. The sound of people adjusting to something unexpected. The sound that came after mistakes or breaches of decorum. I kept my eyes down and tried to become invisible again. But visibility, once granted, was difficult to revoke. An official near the dais interrupted to restore order. An older man, some kind of secretary to the governor, cleared his throat loudly. "The ceremony will now commence," he announced. "Please take your positions." Order was being imposed to erase the moment, to return the room to its proper function. But the attempt felt strained. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had heard my name spoken aloud in response to her direct question. I stepped back slightly to my proper mark against the wall. The guests turned their attention reluctantly back toward the dais, but tension lingered in the room like smoke. The governor's daughter studied me again for a moment before she turned away. I could feel her gaze, even with my eyes lowered, could feel the weight of her curiosity or interest or whatever had prompted her question. I offered no further words, gave no acknowledgement of her attention, became as still as the marble statues that decorated the hall's alcoves. Protocol strained under the breach. The ceremony proceeded, but the rhythm was wrong. Speeches were given, but they sounded hollow. Applause came at the expected moments, but felt mechanical. The governor himself avoided looking in my direction. I noticed this because I had learned to track powerful people's attention as a survival skill. His avoidance was deliberate, pointed. He knew what had happened and he was distancing himself from it. Avoidance after exposure was a common pattern. When something uncomfortable became visible, the powerful pretended not to see it while quietly arranging consequences. The whole dispersed an hour later when the ceremony concluded. Guests moved toward the dining rooms. Officials gathered in small groups for conversation. I remained at my post until the head butler signaled for me to return to the service areas. I followed the other servants through the narrow corridors that ran behind the public rooms. No one spoke to me, but I could feel their awareness. They had seen what happened. They knew I had been singled out. I was summoned aside quietly before I reached the servants' hall. The head butler, a thin white man named Crawford who had worked for the governor's family for 20 years, gestured for me to follow him into a small office off the main corridor. Quiet summons always led to change. Either punishment or reassignment or dismissal. The tone of the summons mattered. This one was not angry, but it was serious. Doors closed behind us. Crawford sat behind a desk covered with ledgers and schedules. I stood in front of the desk with my hands clasped, waiting. That was irregular. Crawford sighed. His voice was neutral, stating fact rather than accusation. "Yes, sir. Miss Carolyn does not typically address house servants directly during formal events." "No, sir. Why do you think she did so this evening?" This was a question used to assign blame, to determine if I had done something to attract her attention, if I had looked at her inappropriately or positioned myself wrong or somehow invited the breach of protocol. I answered minimally. I do not know, sir. You were standing in your assigned position? Yes, sir. You did not make eye contact or gesture toward her? No, sir. Crawford studied me for a long moment. Nevertheless, the situation was irregular. It attracted notice. The governor was displeased by the disruption. Decisions were forming without me. I could sense them taking shape in Crawford's silence. My future was being determined based on something I had not initiated and could not have prevented. You will be reassigned, Crawford said finally, away from the main house and formal events. The stables need additional hands. You will report their beginning tomorrow. Reassignment disguised as routine. This was how the system handled uncomfortable situations. Remove the visible element. Restore the proper order. Pretend nothing significant had occurred. Yes, sir, you understand this is not punishment. Simply a reallocation of resources. It was punishment presented as neutral administrative action. We both knew this, but the pretense had to be maintained. Yes, sir, I understand. You may go. I left the office and returned to the servants' quarters. The other servants watched me but said nothing. They understood what reassignment meant. I had become problematic through no fault of my own, and the system was removing me from proximity to the problem. Word spread beyond the hall that night and through the next day. Stories traveled faster than official orders in any large household. I heard fragments as I worked my final day in the main house. The governor's daughter spoke to him directly, asked his name right in front of everyone. The governor was furious. He's being sent to the stables. The story grew and changed with each telling, but the core remained. I had been noticed. I had been named. And now I was being removed. Scrutiny increased, even as I prepared to leave the main house. Other servants watched to see how I reacted. Officials who had never looked at me before now glanced in my direction when I passed. The governor himself appeared in a corridor where I was collecting linens and stared at me for a long moment before continuing without speaking. I limited my movements, did only the work I was explicitly assigned, spoke only when necessary, tried to fade back into invisibility before the reassignment took effect. But invisibility was no longer possible. I had been seen, named, questioned. The mark of that attention followed me through the corridors like a shadow. I moved to the stables the next morning, carrying my few possessions in a canvas bag. The work was harder and dirtier than house service. Mucking stalls, grooming horses, maintaining tack and equipment. But it was away from the main house, away from formal events, away from the governor's daughter. The moment had become consequence. A simple question, "What is your name?" had altered my position in the household, had changed how I was perceived and where I was allowed to be. I accepted the reassignment because I had no choice, because refusal would have meant dismissal or worse, because survival required adapting to whatever the system demanded. But I carried the knowledge that something had shifted, that I had been visible, briefly, as a person rather than a function, that someone had asked my name and I had answered, and that the system had immediately moved to correct this breach. The weeks that followed confirmed the pattern. The governor's daughter was kept from public events where servants would be present. I learned this from other servants who still worked the main house. She had been restricted to family dinners and private gatherings. Visibility was being controlled after disruption. Both of us were being managed, though in very different ways. She through limitation of movement, me through reassignment and increased distance. I avoided any spaces where I might encounter her, kept to the stables and the grounds, did my work, and returned to the servants' quarters without lingering. Silence was being enforced through spatial separation and unspoken rules. No one said explicitly that I should not be near the main house, but the message was clear in scheduling and in the way other servants redirected me when I approached certain areas. Officials spoke of decorum more frequently than before. I heard this through servants who worked closer to the family. There were new instructions about proper distance and appropriate behavior. Rules were being tightened after the breach. The system was adapting to prevent future irregularities. I followed protocol exactly, giving no cause for additional correction. My name was removed from certain lists in the following months. I noticed this when assignments were posted. Tasks: I had previously been eligible for carrying messages, serving at formal dinners, attending to guests were now given to other servants. Erasure was being used as solution. I was being made invisible again, but through official channels, rather than through the natural anonymity of my role. I kept my work unremarkable, arrived on time, completed tasks without complaint, gave no reason for additional scrutiny, or for anyone to remember that I had once been named in a public hall by the governor's daughter. Attention gradually faded through the winter and into spring. The household returned to its normal rhythms. New events and small scandals captured interest. I became part of the background again, notable only for my absence from spaces where I used to serve. The hall returned to ceremony without mention of what had happened. I heard about these events through other servants. Formal dinners, recognition ceremonies, political gatherings, all proceeding as they had before, with servants maintaining proper invisibility. Normalcy had been rebuilt over truth. The moment when I had been visible and named was being forgotten through deliberate non-acknowledgement. I blended into background labor, stable work, grounds work, tasks that kept me far from the spaces where questions might be asked or names might be spoken. Time compressed through 1859 and into 1860, days were the same. Work was predictable. I survived through routine and through making myself unremarkable. But I sensed lasting caution around unscripted moments throughout the household. Servants were more careful about where they stood during events. Officials were quicker to interrupt any deviation from protocol. The system had learned fear from one breach and was determined to prevent another. I chose silence when possible, spoke only when directly addressed, kept my answers minimal and functional, never offered information that was not explicitly requested. The lesson had settled into the household's bones. Visibility was dangerous. Names created connections that the system could not tolerate. Questions that acknowledged servants as individuals disrupted the careful fiction of their interchangeability. I overheard the question retold in the summer of 1860, nearly 2 years after it happened. 2 younger servants were talking about the governor's daughter, who was engaged to be married. She once asked a servant his name right in the middle of a ceremony. One said, "What happened to him?" "Don't know. He disappeared. Probably sold or sent away." The story was surviving without my name attached to it, without accurate details, without acknowledgement that I was still there, working in the stables, very much not sold or sent away. I did not correct it. The story belonged to the household now, not to me. It had become a cautionary tale about breaching protocol, divorced from the specific people involved. Ownership of truth had shifted. What had happened to me was now a story that served the system's need to enforce boundaries. My fate was quieter and narrower than the story suggested. I had not disappeared. I had simply been moved to a place where I would not be seen by people who might ask questions or use names. Paths were closing after notice. I would not advance. 2 positions of greater responsibility or visibility would not be trusted with tasks that required proximity to the family or to important guests, would remain in the stables or in similar background roles for as long as I worked this household. I endured by routine, by accepting the limitations, by not fighting against the narrowing of possibilities. Years passed inwardly even as they moved slowly in external time. Each day was similar to the last. Each season brought the same work. I aged from 28 to 31 without significant change in circumstances. But the memory remained sharp. The moment when the governor's daughter had looked at me, when she had asked my name, when I had answered and the room had heard. That moment had cost me position and possibility, had narrowed my future, had taught the household to fear similar breaches. But it had also revealed something about the system, about how fragile the fiction of invisible servitude actually was, about how much effort was required to maintain the illusion that servants were not people with names and identities. The system had to work constantly to enforce that illusion, had to reassign and restrict and remove anyone who threatened to expose it. I speak now because the hall never forgot, even as it pretended to forget. The story survived, however distorted. The moment echoed beyond its immediate consequences. One question had changed my trajectory, had shown me the limits of what the system would tolerate, had taught me that visibility itself was transgression. I testify carefully, late, knowing that this record will survive even if my name is lost to it. The governor's daughter asked what my name was. I answered, and everything changed. That was all it took. Word count, 3,076 words. I need to continue to reach approximately 4,000 words. Continuing part 1. The engagement announcement came in the summer of 1860. The governor's daughter would marry a wealthy merchant's son from Charleston in the fall. The wedding would be one of the largest social events Richmond had seen in years. I learned this from the household's increased activity. Extra servants were hired. The gardens were redesigned. The main house was repainted. Everything was being prepared for the celebration and for the scrutiny it would bring. I remained in the stables during these preparations. My work actually increased, as visiting dignitaries would need their horses cared for, their carriages maintained. But I was kept separate from the planning and execution of the social events. One afternoon in August, I was cleaning tack in the stable when I overheard a conversation between two of the temporary servants hired for the wedding preparations. They were taking a break in the shade near the stable entrance. Unaware I was inside. Miss Carolyn is particular about everything, one said. Changes her mind constantly. The head housekeeper is exhausted. I heard she asked to review the list of servants who would be working the wedding events. The other replied, wanted to approve each one personally. That's irregular. Everything about her is irregular. My cousin worked here 2 years ago. Said she once stopped a ceremony to ask a Negro his name. Caused a huge scandal. My hand stopped moving on the leather I was cleaning. I had not heard the story told in my presence before. What happened? The servant disappeared. The governor had him removed. Can't have that sort of thing. It encouraged them to think they matter. The casual cruelty of the assessment sat in my chest like a stone. The belief that acknowledging a servant's humanity encouraged us to believe we mattered as if mattering was something we needed to be prevented from believing. Well, she be someone else's problem soon, the first servant said. Once she's married and moved to Charleston. They moved away then, their voices fading. I returned to cleaning the tack with hands that shook slightly despite my efforts at control. The story persisted, had become part of the household's oral history. A cautionary tale told to new servants about the dangers of irregularity, about the importance of maintaining proper distance. But the story erased me, made me disappear into the servant as if I had no continuing existence, as if the moment had consumed me entirely, rather than simply changing my circumstances. I existed in a strange dual state, present in body, working in the stables, visible to anyone who came to the grounds, but absent from the household's narrative of itself, erased from the story that bore my mark. The wedding preparations intensified through September. I saw the governor's daughter once during this period, from a distance, as she walked in the gardens with her mother. She did not look in my direction, perhaps did not know I was there, perhaps had forgotten entirely the servant she had once asked to name himself. But I had not forgotten, could not forget. The moment lived in my memory with perfect clarity. The way the room had gone silent, the weight of her attention, the sound of my own voice saying my name to a room full of people who were not supposed to hear it. That moment had defined the last 2 years of my life, had narrowed my future, had taught me lessons about visibility and power that I would carry forever. The wedding took place in October 1860. I worked the stables throughout the event, caring for the dozens of horses that brought guests to the celebration. I heard the music from the main house, saw the lights blazing in every window, watched carriages arrive and depart through the long evening. I was not allowed near the house itself, was not part of the celebration in any visible way. My labor supported the event, but from maximum distance, exactly as the system preferred. The governor's daughter became a merchant's wife. and moved to Charleston the following week. The household settled back into its normal rhythms. The extra servants were dismissed. The gardens returned to regular maintenance. Life continued as it had before the preparations began. I remained in the stables, would remain there. I understood, for the duration of my time in this household, the breach I had been part of would not be forgotten by those who made decisions about assignments and advancement. I had been marked by that moment of visibility, and the mark would not fade. But something had changed in me during those 2 years. An understanding had formed that I had not possessed before. The system depended on our silence, on our acceptance of invisibility, on our willingness to pretend we did not exist as individuals with names and thoughts and interior lives. When that pretense broke down, even briefly, even in a moment as small as a question and an answer, the system had to work to restore it, had to reassign and restrict and remove the people involved, had to turn the moment into a cautionary tale that erased the actual people and reinforced the rules. But the work required to maintain the pretense revealed its fragility, revealed that invisibility was not natural or inevitable, that it had to be constantly enforced. This knowledge was dangerous. I understood why the system worked so hard to prevent moments like the one I had experienced, because such moments revealed the truth beneath the careful fiction. We were not invisible. We were made invisible through deliberate effort and constant reinforcement, and what was made could be unmade. I could not act on this knowledge, could not speak it openly, could not organize resistance or challenge the system directly. The cost would be too high and the outcome already determined, but I could carry the knowledge, could preserve it in my memory and in my testimony given much later when the circumstances allowed. I speak now, years after the moment, because the whole did not forget even as it claimed to forget, because the story survived even as it erased my name from itself, because one question echoed through the household and changed, however slightly, how the system had to work to maintain its fictions. The governor's daughter asked what my name was. I answered, Joseph, and the system had to spend 2 years correcting that simple exchange, had to reassign me, had to restrict her, had to tell and retell the story as a warning, had to work constantly to restore the invisibility that should have been automatic if the fiction were actually true. The effort revealed the lie. That was what I learned in that hall when she asked, and I answered. That was what I carry still. The system was powerful but not effortless, was maintained but not natural, required constant work to preserve the pretense that we did not exist as individuals. And any moment when that pretense failed, however briefly, was a crack in the foundation. One question, one answer, one name spoken aloud. It was enough to show the fragility beneath the power. The Civil War came to Virginia. In 1861, the governor's mansion became a center of Confederate operations and logistics. I remained in the stables through the transformation, caring for military horses now instead of civilian carriages. The household changed around the war's demands. Many servants were sent to work on fortifications or assigned to support military operations. I was kept at the stables because the work was essential and because my reassignment 2 years earlier had placed me in a role that was useful to the war effort. The governor's daughter did not return from Charleston. Her husband had joined the Confederate Army. She stayed south with his family while he fought. I thought the story would die with her absence, that without her physical presence, the memory of that November evening would fade completely from the household's consciousness. But the story survived. New servants, hired to replace those sent to military service, were told the tale as part of their orientation. The cautionary lesson about maintaining proper distance and not encouraging irregularity. I heard it retold in 1862 by a young man who had just been assigned to the household. He was speaking to another new servant while I worked nearby in the stables. They say the governor's daughter once tried to be friendly with the servants, asked one his name during a formal event, created a scandal. What happened? The governor made sure it never happened again. That's why we have such strict rules now about positioning and eye contact. The story had evolved. In this version, She had tried to be friendly, as if the question had been part of some sustained effort, rather than a single moment. As if she bore responsibility for disrupting proper order, and the story claimed the household's strict rules had been created in response to her action. As if the rules had not always existed. As if the system of enforced invisibility were somehow new. I did not correct the story, but I noticed how it had changed to serve different purposes, to justify existing restrictions by giving them a founding narrative, to transform a moment of human curiosity into a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing boundaries. The war intensified through 1862 and 1863. The governor became more involved in Confederate logistics. The household became more militarized. Servants were watched more carefully for signs of disloyalty or communication with Union forces. I kept my head down and did my work, fed horses, cleaned stalls, maintained equipment, said nothing about the war or politics or the future, but I listened. In stables and grounds, people talked more freely than they did in the main house. Soldiers discussed battles. Officers complained about supply problems. Servants whispered about Union advances and the possibility of freedom. By 1860, for it was clear the Confederacy was losing. Richmond would fall eventually. The question was when, and what would happen to those of us who had served Confederate officials when it did. The governor began making preparations to abandon Richmond if Union forces came too close. Documents were packed. Valuables were moved. Contingency plans were discussed in voices I overheard while working near the main house. In April 1865, Richmond fell to Union forces. The governor fled south with his family and closest staff. I was not among those chosen to accompany him. Most of the household servants remained in Richmond, suddenly free under Union occupation, but without clear understanding of what that freedom meant or how to exercise it. I was 34 years old, had been enslaved my entire life, had spent the last 7 years working in stables because I had answered a simple question with my name. The Union Army established control over the city, distributed food and temporary housing, began the complex work of transition from slavery to freedom. I stayed at the governor's residence initially because I had nowhere else to go. The property was placed under Union administration. The stables still needed care, even under new authority. But now, when Union officers asked my name, I could answer without consequence. Joseph. I would say just Joseph. I don't have a family name. You can choose one. An officer told me, "You're free now." Free people have full names. I had not thought about this, had been Joseph for 34 years, had understood my identity as singular and simple because the system had not allowed for more complexity. "I'll think on it," I said. In May 1865, I testified for the first time about conditions in the governor's household during slavery. A Union commission was documenting the treatment of enslaved people by Confederate officials, building records for potential war crimes trials. I told them about the work assignments, the restrictions, the system of control that governed every aspect of our lives. I described the hierarchy of servants and the way power flowed through the household. And I told them about the evening in November 1858 when the governor's daughter asked my name. The commissioner, a white man from Massachusetts named Howard, listened carefully and took notes. "Why is this incident significant?" he asked. "Because it revealed how the system worked," I said. How much effort was required to maintain the fiction that we were not people, that we did not have names or identities. But she asked your name. That seems like recognition of your humanity. It was. That is why the system had to correct it immediately, had to reassign me, had to restrict her, had to turn the moment into a cautionary tale. Howard wrote for several minutes in silence. Then he looked up. "You understand this testimony may not result in any prosecution. The governor has fled. His family is beyond Union jurisdiction. I understand. But the testimony matters anyway. Someone should record what happened, how the system worked, what it cost to maintain it, the cost to you specifically being reassignment to the stables, the cost to me being 7 years of narrowed possibility. but the larger cost being the constant work required to enforce invisibility. To prevent any moment of recognition from occurring, Howard nodded slowly. This is useful testimony. I will include it in my report. I never learned if the report led to any consequences for the governor or his family. Probably not. The chaos of Reconstruction created many opportunities for former Confederate officials to escape accountability. But the testimony existed, had been recorded in official Union documents, would survive in archives even if it led to no immediate justice. The hidden truth that had begun to form in my mind during those years in the stables was now being spoken aloud and written down. The system of slavery had not been maintained through physical force alone. It had been maintained through careful fictions about who counted as human and who did not, about who deserved names and recognition and who must remain invisible. And those fictions required constant work, required immediate correction when they broke down, required reassignment and restriction and the transformation of human moments into cautionary tales. The fragility of the fictions revealed the falseness of their claims to naturalness and inevitability. The system's flaw was now fully exposed in my testimony, and in the testimony of thousands of other formerly enslaved people throughout the South. We had never been actually invisible. We had been made invisible through deliberate effort that had to be constantly maintained and enforced. When the effort stopped when Union occupation ended the power to enforce invisibility, the fiction collapsed immediately. We were revealed as what we had always been, people with names and identities and interior lives. The human cost became clearer in the months and years after emancipation. I spoke with other formerly enslaved people about their experiences, heard stories similar to mine about moments when their humanity had been briefly visible and the consequences that followed. A woman who had been sold away from her children because she cried too loudly at a funeral, making her grief visible in a way that discomfited her enslavers. A man who had been whipped because he made eye contact with a white woman in a store, his action interpreted as presumption rather than accidental acknowledgement. A family that had been separated because the father had learned to read, his literacy creating the possibility of thought and communication that the system could not tolerate. Each story revealed the same pattern. Any moment when enslaved people's humanity became visible required correction. The system could not allow such moments to accumulate or normalize. My story was mild compared to many. I had been reassigned, not sold or beaten or killed, but the underlying logic was the same. Visibility was transgression. Recognition was threat. The cost was measured not just in individual punishments, but in the constant psychological weight of enforced invisibility, in the necessity of making ourselves smaller and quieter and less present in order to survive, in the knowledge that any moment of recognition, even something as simple as being asked our name, could bring consequences that would narrow our lives. I settled in Richmond after the war, found work as a carpenter, learned the trade through practice and instruction from other freedmen who were building the new city. I chose a family name, Freeman, Joseph Freeman. It was not subtle, but it was honest. I had been freed by historical forces beyond my control, and I carried that freedom in my name. I married in 1867, had children, built a life that would have been impossible under slavery. But I never forgot the lesson of that November evening, never forgot how the system had responded to a simple question and answer. How much work had been required to restore the fiction of my invisibility. The governor's daughter returned to Richmond in 1870, widowed by the war. Her husband had died at Gettysburg. She came back to her father's former residence, which had been purchased by a Union sympathizer and partially restored. I saw her once, from a distance, walking in the city. She was 30 years old and looked older. The war had aged everyone who survived it. I wondered if she remembered asking my name, if she knew what had followed from that question, if she understood the cost of a moment's curiosity in a system that demanded ignorance. I never approached her to ask. We existed in different worlds, despite living in the same city. The war had ended slavery, but had not created equality. The boundaries between white and black Richmond remained rigid even in freedom. but I carried the memory and the knowledge it had created. Officials in post-war Richmond spoke often of decorum and proper behavior. The language was different, but the underlying impulse was similar. Keep black people in designated spaces. Limit visibility and recognition. Maintain hierarchies through unspoken rules. The rules were tightening in new ways, even as formal slavery ended. This was the system adapting to changed circumstances while preserving as much of its structure as possible. I followed the new protocols because resistance carried costs I could not afford with a family depending on me. But I recognized the pattern, recognized how the fiction of black invisibility was being rebuilt through different mechanisms. My name had been removed from certain contexts, even in freedom. When I worked on construction projects for white clients, I was rarely called by name, just boy or you, there, or no name at all. Erasure continued as a tool of control. But now I understood it as a tool rather than as natural order. Understood that it required work to maintain, that it revealed insecurity and fragility rather than natural hierarchy. This knowledge was passed to my children. I told them the story of the evening when the governor's daughter asked my name, explained what had followed and what it revealed. They have to work to keep us invisible. I told them, that means we are not actually invisible. It means they are afraid of what happens when we become visible. My son, born in 1868, asked, "What does happen?" The system has to adjust, has to enforce new rules, has to spend energy maintaining fictions that would collapse if left unattended. So visibility is power. Visibility is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement creates the possibility of change. That is why they work so hard to prevent it. The hall where I had been asked my name was converted to offices after the war. The grandeur was diminished. The chandeliers were removed for sale. The marble floors were covered with rough carpeting, but the space remained. I walked past it sometimes, looked at the walls, where I had stood holding a silver tray, remembered the moment when I had been visible and the years of consequences that followed. I sense lasting caution even now, decades later, around unscripted moments between black and white people in formal settings. The fear that recognition might lead to acknowledgement, that might lead to demands for equality. The system learned from its breaches, learned to prevent moments like the one I experienced, learned to maintain distance through new methods suited to the post-slavery world. But the lesson I learned was different. I learned that the work required to maintain invisibility revealed its falseness, that systems which must be constantly enforced are not natural or inevitable, that a simple question, "What is your name?" followed by a simple answer, "Joseph," could reveal the fragility of elaborate fictions about who counted as human. I choose silence in many contexts even now, because speech carries costs, because visibility invites scrutiny and potential consequences, because survival requires strategic calculation of when to be seen and when to fade into background. But I testify now, in writing given to people who are recording the experiences of formerly enslaved people, because the truth matters, even when it cannot change what happened. The record I create here will survive me, will exist in archives, will perhaps be read by people who need to understand how the system of slavery worked, not just through physical force, but through constant enforcement of invisibility. Years have passed since that November evening. I am 54 now. The governor is dead. His daughter is an elderly widow. The world that created that moment is gone, but the moment echoes still, in my memory, in the household stories that survive, in the lesson about what it costs to maintain fictions about human invisibility. I speak now because the whole never forgot even as it claimed to forget, because the question echoed through years and circumstances and became something larger than its immediate moment. One question, one answer, one name spoken aloud in a room that was not supposed to hear it. That was all it took to reveal how the system worked, how much effort was required to maintain it, how fragile the fictions were beneath their appearance of solidity. The governor's daughter asked what my name was. I answered, Joseph. The system spent 7 years correcting that exchange, reassigning me, restricting her, retelling the story as a warning. working constantly to restore the invisibility that should have been automatic if the fiction were true. The effort revealed the lie, and the lie, once revealed, could never be completely hidden again. That is what I carry from that moment. That is what I testify to now. The system was powerful but not natural, was maintained but required constant work, was fragile beneath its apparent strength, and any moment of recognition, however small, was a crack in the foundation. The question was simple, the answer was simple, but the truth revealed by that exchange was profound. We were never invisible. We were always human. The system knew this and worked constantly to deny it. And in the end, the work required to maintain the denial proved the truth it tried to hide. I was Joseph. I am Joseph Freeman. I existed then and I exist now. That is the testimony. That is the truth. The system could not erase no matter how hard it tried. One name spoken aloud in a hall full of people who were supposed to believe I had no name. That was enough.